The year is 2004, the venue is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and the event is the induction of George Harrison. These inductions traditionally feature a performance from the artist, but sadly, it was too late for that. Harrison had passed away 3 years earlier from complications due to lung cancer, so the ceremony celebrated his life and his work the only way musicians know how. With a tribute concert. After a couple speeches, an all-star band took the stage to perform some of Harrison's greatest hits, including his son Danny, longtime collaborators Tom Petty, Steve Winwood, and Jeff Lynne, and a handful of supporting artists from their bands to fill out the lineup. Oh, and one more guy. The event's producer, Joel Gallen, figured that since Harrison had written Well My Guitar Gently Weeps, probably the most iconic song about the instrument, it would only be fitting to include a performance of it featuring another legendary guitarist who happened to be getting inducted that same year. Prince. I think you see where this is going. During rehearsals, Prince opted not to play his solo, instead letting ELO guitarist Mark Mann fill that space, and when Gallen spoke to him about it, he said to let Mann take the middle solo, and he'd just come in at the end. When Gallen expressed doubt, Prince told him, and I quote, "Don't worry about it." So as the band took the stage, no one but Prince knew what Prince was going to do, and for the first half of the song, it looked like he wasn't gonna do much of anything. He stuck to the shadows on the side of the stage, quietly comping along while Lynne and Petty traded vocals, and Mann took the middle solo as planned. Then, 3.5 minutes in, they finish the last verse, Prince steps forward, the spotlight shifts, and, well, what happens next is what this whole video's about. This video is sponsored by Nebula. With any solo, I like to start by looking at the chord changes because those will affect the choices the soloist makes. Here, the entire 3-minute solo takes place over the verse progression, a looping 8-bar phrase that'll break into 2 halves. For the first half, the band takes an A minor triad and holds that chord steady while walking the bass down from A to G, F sharp, and F. We could put chord symbols over that if we wanted to, but this sort of harmony is much more about voice leading. The contrast between the static, unmoving top notes and the slowly descending bass line creates this wonderful, unresolved tension that perfectly captures the melancholy sadness of the lyrics, especially with the F sharp and F natural rubbing up against each other at the end. As for the second half, I like to think of it as elaborating on that falling bass line. It starts on A minor again, then steps down to G, but this time the rest of the notes follow, so we get an actual G major chord and some real harmonic motion. The F sharp chord from before gets flipped around into D major, which still prominently features that major 6th, and then the F chord is completely replaced with E major, the 5, which strongly points back to 1. These similarities make the second half feel like he's being reborn, as the sadness gives way to action, and the borrowed major chords near the end imply hope, or at least acceptance. Over the first static section, Prince starts with some bends up to a high E, that eventually settle down to a D. This is going to be a recurring motif throughout the solo. Not these specific notes, but the pattern of taking a moment to repeatedly bend up to a single note over and over is going to pop up a lot, which, yeah, I don't want to be too obvious, but it has to be said that a dramatic whole step bend to a high note is probably the closest you can get on a guitar to the actual sound of weeping. It's a lovely piece of tone painting that plays with the lyrics, and Prince wasn't the first person to think of it. In the original song, the solo is played by Eric Clapton, one of the few non-Beatles to ever play lead on a Beatles track, and he starts off in a very similar way. But Prince still makes this moment his with a couple significant changes. First, and most obviously, he takes it up an octave into a register that sounds like a more desperate sort of crying. Which makes sense. In the original, Harrison, and by extension Clapton, are mourning the slow, mundane breakup of the band, but here, Prince is memorializing the death of a legend. Second, Clapton was playing his bends in half notes, punctuating the backbeat, whereas Prince starts by holding one for a while, then drops into this dotted quarter note figure, hitting a new bend every 3/8 notes. This creates an exciting cross rhythm against the pulse, hinting at the more bombastic approach he plans to take throughout the solo. And finally, there's the bend itself. Clapton stays pretty consistent on them, but to my ears, it sounds like Prince bends a little less each time, slowly sinking into this microtonal slide toward the target D at the end of the line. That throws him into the world of blue notes, giving it a distinctly painful, tragic edge that Clapton's lacked. This opening line is a declaration that Prince came to play. Once he has your attention, he launches into a much more dynamic lick. Here, he seems to be mostly focused on establishing the key of A minor, along with the Dorian scale he's going to be using throughout the piece. He starts by bending to that high E again, then falls off it and walks down an A minor triad. Then he takes advantage of the G chord in the harmony to lean hard on B, grinding out that half-step dissonance before eventually resolving it up to C to release the tension. That's still over the G chord, which brings up an important point. I know I said the chord progression would help us understand the solo, but to be honest, Prince doesn't seem all that concerned by it. He's largely taking a more blues-inspired approach of picking a scale and sticking with it as the chords change. I don't want to say the chords don't matter, because they clearly shape the overall contour of his solo, but in terms of specific note choices, they're often not directly related. He's more painting a picture of A Dorian than he is locking himself into this one particular path through it, which works particularly well in a progression like this where the first half is basically all one chord. That's why, despite being part of the current harmony, it's the B, not the C, that winds up sounding dissonant. From there, he does a bendy little trill on C before dropping back to A, and while I've notated this as 16th notes, if I slow it down, you can hear a little swing to it, giving a little more time to the C and a little more bounce to the eventual return to A. And finally, over the E chord, he breaks from the harmony completely, mostly jamming out on A's in different octaves, with some F sharps thrown in to re-emphasize that Dorian sound. So let's talk about Dorian. As we saw, the chords were ambivalent between F sharp and F natural, but Prince's solo takes a pretty definitive side. I can't find a single F in the whole thing. He does pay enough attention to avoid hitting F sharp over an F chord, and the F sharps are rarely all that emphasized, but it's clear that he prefers this version of the 6. And that makes sense. From a soloist's perspective, you often have to think about which notes to avoid in which contexts, and the flat 6 is a tricky one to use. It doesn't play well with the 5 or the 2, and every chord in the progression contains either an E, a B, or at the very least an F sharp, so it's hard to find a place to fit F natural that doesn't sound sour. He could do it, and he's Prince, so I'm sure he could make it work, but it doesn't fit the vibe of the solo, so he leaves it out. In the next lick, we see him move in a new direction. The range has dropped a bit, moving from that high E down to a still high but slightly lower G, the flat 7 of the key. I tend to think of the flat 7 as having a really hollow sound. It's not consonant, but it also doesn't have anywhere specific to go, so it's just aimlessly dissonant. Hitting it right at the start of the phrase, right where that E chord with its much more directional G sharp is supposed to resolve to A, gives this a beautifully poignant sound, especially as he slowly bends up to it from the F sharp below. He releases some of that with a walk down to E, but then immediately bounces back up, and honestly, I had a bit of a problem notating this next part. Staff notation doesn't give me an easy way to capture the chaos of this rhythm, as he wails away on that G, fighting against the F sharp in the bass, before the two notes resolve in opposite directions to a consonant dyad of F and A in the 4th bar. At the end of the phrase, he quickly walks that A down an octave, and then he does something I think more guitarists could stand to do in their solos. He stops, for a whole bar. This moment of rest serves a couple purposes. First, you may have noticed the vocals were back. Every other time through the 8-bar loop, Petty, Harrison, and the rest of the singers come back in to sing parts of the refrain, and Prince has clearly structured his solo to make space for them. He's not always chill in these parts, but he's working around them, and especially since this is the first time it's happened, leaving this gap makes it clear the two parts are in active conversation. They're not just interrupting him. But even without that, it's nice to have a chance to breathe. This is a really long solo, and it needs some ebb and flow. If all he did was blast out as many notes as he could for 3 whole minutes, that'd pretty quickly get exhausting, both for his fingers and for the listener's ears. Prince is delivering thoughtful, careful packages of musical meaning. Adding some slower sections and even some straight-up gaps in the solo gives you time to absorb each one before he starts the next. Which is particularly good here because, well, check out what's next. There's a cute little pentatonic lick to ease us back in, and then the dam breaks and we get this absurd barrage of notes that carries over through the end of the phrase. This is another thing we'll see a couple times through the solo. While he's clearly aware of the phrase boundaries, he does seem to enjoy contradicting them. He often starts a new idea over the E chord and then carries it through into the start of the next line, so the structure feels less rigid, more organic, and maybe a little disorienting. And he has a particular flourish he likes to employ, where he starts off with a fast but reasonably in-time pattern. Then, as the phrase rolls over, he speeds it up to a ridiculous degree. I have these notated as triplets, but honestly, I think he's just picking as fast as he can, and any alignment between these attacks and the underlying meter is probably a coincidence. It's a raw, emotional approach that can't really sustain for that long without sounding sloppy. Prince holds on that razor's edge as long as he can before releasing the tension with a massive throw, and returning to the pulse. We're going to see these sorts of throws a lot throughout the solo, and they mostly come in two flavors. There's throws like this that punctuate the end of a huge frenetic build-up, and then there's throws that come before something exciting, almost like he's saying, hey, check this out. It's a great example of thinking beyond the notes. He's treating the guitar not as some abstract way of enacting musical ideas, but as a physical instrument that he can physically manipulate, and I think that perspective is so important in a truly great solo. And while the next section is still blazing fast, after the last couple bars, it honestly feels like a cool down. There was too much momentum to just stop cold, but here he returns to a straighter rhythm with clear accents on the beats to start to rein in this monster of a solo. He is mostly playing 16th notes on an open high E string, with this walk down the scale from 5 to 1 happening on top. For each one, he quickly frets the note, then pulls off it, giving just the briefest little touch of melody sitting on top of this pounding rhythm. Once it arrives on A, he finally settles down with this little encircling lick, dancing around the root with the notes on either side before resolving it, and finally, for the first time in what feels like ages, plays a freaking quarter note. We made it to our next moment of rest. These next 4 bars remind me of what he played the first time through this moving chord section, starting on A, moving up to B for some tension, then dropping back to A to close out the thought. He's taking that idea and distilling it down to its simplest form. This is a great little breather, not as complete as the full dropout he played earlier, but it's low, slow, and easy. It's not asking a lot from us as listeners, because I don't know about you, but at this point my ears are exhausted and there's still 2 minutes to go. At the end of that, he does another quick throw, then sets up the next big idea, a return to that high G, which he then bends up to A and back down again. This is a nice development of the last time we saw the G. Instead of sitting on it forever and building tension, he gives us the resolution right away and then keeps resolving over and over as the chords change, letting us hear that same motion in a bunch of different harmonic contexts. After a couple bars of that, he turns it around and leaps up to a high D, which seems to promise he's about to do the same thing again, but this time resolving up to the E instead. But he doesn't. He turns it around, repeatedly unbending the D down to C at a much faster rate. This might actually be an intentional quote from the original solo, because Clapton did the same thing. That leads into another one of his pattern accelerations, where he starts playing this syncopated figure on A and C before speeding up to barely timed 16ths. Culminating in a high C, which is the first time we've really heard him sit on the minor third. He's played it plenty, but never as an accent, so this moment brings a new sort of tone color that reinforces the darkness of that minor sound, especially since, in true ignoring the chords fashion, he's playing it over an E major, so it rubs hard against the B in the harmony. It's classic blues stuff. The next phrase again changes to a new vocabulary, this time dropping low and slowly walking up the scale from E to E, ending on a hammer-on trill to mark his arrival at the top. Unlike before, these 16ths do feel pretty locked in. He's fast, but he's not rushing. And that's part of the point. We all know that Prince can play in time, but if he never actually does it, then the chaotic parts lose their magic. Balancing those machine gun blasts with more normal 16ths is a way of reassuring the audience that when he breaks out, it's definitely on purpose. When you're walking up a 7-note scale like this, you have a choice to make. If you just play each note for one beat, you'll wind up hitting the end early. There's a couple ways around that, but the easiest one is to double up one of the notes, and that's exactly what Prince does, holding the G for 2 beats at the end of the first bar. This not only shifts the final E onto the downbeat where he wants it, it also shifts the A in the middle onto a downbeat as well, giving him both of these stable notes in strong metric positions. It's pretty sweet. The drop down low also helps reposition your expectations. He's been wailing away in the high upper register for a long time, so taking a break and building energy a different way ensures that next time he works his way back up there, they'll still sound climactic. It's not really resting per se, but it is using a different set of musical muscles. From there we get this little blues lick featuring some quick bends to the flat 5, keeping the range low for a little while longer, then he erupts into one of his biggest flourishes. This is a technique he foreshadowed a little earlier, playing 16ths on the open E string and occasionally fretting a high note. But that bit was a cooldown, and here he's clearly winding you up, so he makes a couple changes. First, instead of doing a complete walk down the scale, he just alternates between fretting the E, D, and occasionally both, so it stays in that piercing high triumphant range. And second, whereas before he was fretting every 4th 16th note so his accents aligned with the beat, here he frets every 3rd 16th, creating a dotted 8th cross rhythm that builds rhythmic tension toward an eventual release. Third, well, before he was following one of his pattern accelerations, so he was really careful to stay locked into the pulse, here he's ramping up so he adds an acceleration to the end, speeding up his picking as he hits the phrase boundary. Oh, and fourth, he aggressively crosses the phrase boundary. Before, this pattern came on the 3rd and 4th bars of the progression, winding their way to a resolution on the downbeat of bar 5, but here he starts on bar 7 and carries through bar 1 of the next phrase as if nothing happened. Ooh, and 5th, he takes it up. After 3 bars of this, he permanently frets that high E and hammers the G above it, building even more rhythmic and melodic tension. That finally releases in a triumphant return to that weeping motif from the intro, with a slow high bends and the dotted quarter cross rhythm, but this time he's moved it even higher to an A, and after all that chaos, it feels so tremendously satisfying. And then there's the 6th change, the one that words simply can't capture. As Prince begins this line, he turns his back to the crowd, faces Petty and Harrison, looks them dead in the eyes, then trust falls backward toward the audience. He's caught by a security guard who holds him there for a couple seconds, then helps him back up, and through all of that, he doesn't miss a note. It's incredible, and while I don't usually like cutting away from the video, I think you deserve to see it. Right? That rules. And he follows it up with my favorite part of the whole solo, the part where he stops playing for 4 bars. Okay, I know how that sounds, but I didn't mean it like that. I just think it's a really bold and artistically mature choice. He knows what he just did was amazing, and he knows that if he tried to follow it up immediately, it's probably gonna fall flat. A less experienced soloist might say, screw it, I'll just do something even better, but Prince is too smart to fall into that sort of arms race against himself, so he waits and gives the audience time to think about what they just saw. He does give Petty a look to let him know he's not done, which, again, I think you deserve to see. But he's in no rush. He knows the spotlight's his for as long as he wants it. When he finally does come back in, it's with the most traditional riff in the whole piece, which he plays 4 times, easing you back in through simple repetition. It's a cool line because he's Prince, but it's not meant to be a particularly exciting moment or anything. It's mostly an announcement that he's gonna keep going. The last thing he played was explosive, too explosive to make a really satisfying ending. He needs to wind his way back down, release some of that heat, and this line gets things moving in that direction. And again, I know I keep saying this, but that's because it's important. Great solos aren't all high points. They can't be. You need moments of relative calm to compare them to. He gave us some rest with a 4-bar break, but even still, screaming back in with another blazing fast pattern acceleration wouldn't sound exciting because it wouldn't feel like he earned it. This lick bridges the gap so that whatever comes next can be heard in its correct context. And what comes next is... okay, yeah, it's another blazing fast pattern acceleration. But do you see how much better this feels because there was something else in front of it? I'm right. No further questions, Your Honor. Anyway, we already talked about the speed thing, so instead I want to focus in on the note choices because he's doing something really cool. It's a repeated walk from A to C. So, does that sound at all familiar? I mean, probably not, because the rhythm's completely different, but it is the structure of the main verse melody. Now, is that an intentional reference? I don't know, but I do know that melody ends with a step up to D, then back down to C, and so does Prince. So, make whatever guesses you want, but I think he knew what he was doing. That high D releases into this big run down the scale, settling into a lower E, which he's bending just like he did at the start. But now, instead of playing a dotted quarter rhythm, he's playing dotted half notes. This slower pace makes it harder to pick out the syncopation, so it kinda just feels like he's throwing out notes at random, really reveling in that deep, mournful sound of the bent string. That feeds into this loose, out-of-time fill that I've done my best to notate. But trying to lock this into a 16th note grid feels pretty wrong. It's a chaotic unraveling of musical time. And now we find ourselves in the home stretch. There's just a couple more sections to talk about, and for most of it, he's pretty chill. He starts by once again adopting a new technique, playing a slow, low, and most of all deliberate melody in octaves. It's kind of like that thing we saw him do in some of the other moving sections where he plays around with the relationship between A and B, but this time he delays the resolution. Instead of returning to A over the D chord, he drops down to G and holds that for half a bar before finally sliding back up, letting you sit in that tension for longer and softening the sense of closure. But let's talk about the octaves. This seems to be Prince's answer to a pretty difficult question. After a bombastic 2 minutes of virtuosic guitar acrobatics, how do you dismount? How could you possibly bring this to a conclusion without disappointing? And while this isn't actually the end of the solo, it is effectively the end of its journey. The story's been told, the painting's been painted, so how do you wrap it up? Dropping low and slowing down are good choices, providing a sharp contrast with the screaming highs and blistering runs of the solo's climactic moments, but abandoning all that energy also makes it sound weak. The line needs reinforcement, and harmonizing it in octaves gives the section a sense of power, pride, and purpose, making it clear that while he's settling down, this isn't him giving up. There's a heft to the sound that comes from those low harmonies, while the higher parts give it clarity. It's a great solution to a pretty unsolvable problem. And the structure's interesting too. The next 4 bars also feature an octave line, in this case a walk up the scale, which, by the way, includes some of the only really clearly accented F sharps in the whole thing, but the point is that for the first time, we have a full 8-bar section with its own consistent musical identity. That'd line up perfectly with the 8-bar loop of the chords, so of course he doesn't do that. Instead, he starts the octaves during the moving section, where he sits relatively still, then carries it into the static section where he becomes increasingly animated, almost as if he's mocking the progression and daring it to try to contain him. That ends with one more throw, and then he finally begins to fade into the background. In the next 4 bars, he strums along with the harmony, adding some little licks in between to keep himself in the mix, but he's clearly letting go of the reins and telling the rest of the band that this time, he's actually done. In the next 4 bars, he returns fully to the rhythm part, and after a quick glance over to confirm, Petty gives the signal to wrap up. But Prince has one last trick up his sleeve. As the band slows down, he comes back in for one last high bend. Before, he was always bending on a relatively consonant note like A or E, but here he starts out with a high G instead, hitting us with that painful emptiness of the flat 7 one last time. After 2 bars of that, he releases up to A, which leads into a beautiful, slow walk down the scale to match the ritardando from the rest of the band. Then we get this big Vegas ending as everyone just mashes out the final chord. Prince holds an E, occasionally hammering up to a G, but never quite making it back to that final A. To me, it feels a little bitter and unresolved, paying tribute to the icon who couldn't be in the room with him that night. Then he takes off his guitar, throws it into the crowd, and walks off stage without a word. And that's it. After 3 minutes, one of the greatest guitar solos ever played is over, and the crowd is left to reflect on the magic they just witnessed. But there's one aspect of this performance that I haven't really covered. The historical context. Well, My Guitar Gently Weeps isn't just any song. It's George Harrison's eulogy for the breakup of his band, and more importantly the friendships between them that seemed inevitable in the wake of their disastrous retreat to India. I didn't have time to really get into that side of the story, but that's okay. Lindsay Ellis already did it for me in her incredible video, The Ballad of John and Yoko. It's really good, and like everything Lindsay's making these days, it's available exclusively on Nebula. In it, she goes on a journey through the history of the Beatles, the aftermath of their breakup, and the over-the-top backlash faced by John Lennon and especially Yoko Ono. It's really well made and really well told, and it's just one of the great originals available on Nebula. Maggie Mae Fish has a fantastic series called Unrated about the adult history of film. There's Archaeology Quest, where Stephanie from Real Science tries to master ancient skills, and of course Lindsay has a bunch of other video essays there as well. I've been working with Nebula for a really long time now, and it's been so cool to watch it grow from the little website we first built into such an exciting streaming platform with so many incredible creators, including many of my favorite music channels like Adam Neely, Mary Spender, and Polyphonic. And right now, they're even offering a lifetime subscription for $300, so you can pay once and never have to worry about it again. Honestly, I still think the annual subscription is a better deal. If you sign up with a link in the description, you'll get 40% off that, which comes out to just $30 a year or $250 a month. Hard to beat. But the lifetime membership helps fund the development of even more cool originals in the future, so if you like what we're doing over there and you want to help us do more of it, a lifetime membership is a great way to do that. Plus, as always, a portion of your payment goes directly to me, so if you like what I'm doing, that helps too. Oh, and also I should mention, I've decided to make those outro sections where I talk a bit more off the cuff about the video production Nebula exclusive. I like making them, and I know some of y'all like watching them, but YouTube gets mad when people don't watch the whole video, so I'm moving them to a platform that won't punish me for including extra stuff for the people who want it. Thanks, Nebula. And hey, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making this video possible, and thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sundgaard, Howard Levine, Warren Hewart, Damian Fuller-Sutherland, John Hancock, Neil Moore, and Jeff. Don't forget to check out the Nebula cut for a fuller outro, and for anyone who made it this far, keep on rockin'.